Well, welcome to chapter 19. And in chapter 19, we're going to be learning the future active and the future middle indicative and a few other odds and ends. All right. English grammar first. How do you form the future in English? It's really easy. We just use will, right? And so I eat goes to I will eat. In older English, the shall was used instead of will in the first person. I shall, you will. But except for older Bible translations and when we want to use the future as an imperative, we generally don't use shall anymore. We just use will. So we form the future in English by adding a helping verb in, which is will. In English, we have three what are called principal parts. So they are the present, past, and past perfect. And there's different ways that we form these different principal parts for a verb. We have, for example, regular verbs like kick. In order that goes to the past, it's kicked. And in the past perfect, it's the same word, it's kicked. And we have other words like swim, swam, swum, where we're changing a vowel in it. And we have verbs that are completely irregular, like eat, ate, eaten. So three principal parts for verbs in English. Present, past, and past perfect. The point of all that is that we form the future with the present principal part. So you say I eat, and then you use the same principal part, eat, and you say I will eat. Okay? So English grammar. Let's switch over to Greek. In the Greek verbal system, as I said in the past, aspect is generally more important than time. That's why you can have a present tense verb used of a future or a past action. Though when you get into the future in Greek, it's almost all time. It's very little aspect. It's future verbs really talk about future events. And when it comes to translating these, you'll use will, obviously. But in terms of aspect, we don't use the future continuous. Hardly at all. It sounds really weird. And so you will use a future undefined in your translation. So I eat goes to I will eat. We generally don't say I will be eating, which would be the future continuous. So we use the future undefined to translate the Greek future verb. Okay, so the question then is, how do you form a Greek future active? Well, I'm glad you asked. You form a future active indicative by having a future active tense stem. In other words, we're going to be using a different tense stem to form the future. And then to that future active tense stem, we add something called a tense formative. And in the future, the tense formative is a sigma. In other words, the sigma is what is used to form the future tense, hence the tense formative. After the tense formative, we have a connecting vowel, same ones, omicrons and epsilons. And then we have primary active personal endings. In other words, these are the same endings that we have in the present active. So no new endings to learn in this chapter. So you have the stem lu, you add your tense formative sigma, you add your connecting vowel omicron, your primary active personal ending men, and you end up with lusamen. If you look at the full paradigm, it's luso, luses, luce, lusamen, lucite, lususi with a new movable. They mean I will loose, you will loose, and it's he, she, it will loose. I just ran out of room on the video paradigm, so I just said he will loose. Same connecting vowels, same primary active personal endings, and I stuck the present active there just so you could compare them. But one of the things this means is take the form like luce. You're going to see the epsilon iota, and you're going to know it's third person singular. You're going to see the lu, so you know it's from the word luo. But now you have to look at one more thing. You have to look at what comes right before the personal ending. It's a sigma. It's not part of the stem. It's sigma, and therefore you know that that's a future. So you can't look just at the ending and the beginning. You've got to look at what comes before the personal ending now as well. And then there are our friends, the contract verbs. And something a little different happens here because there's no connecting vowel to touch up against the final contract vowel. So there's no contraction. So the rule is this. For contract verbs, they lengthen their final stem vowel before the tense formative. Now make sure you learn the rule that way. Don't memorize it that they are going to lengthen their vowel before the sigma of the future. And the reason for that is that there are other tense formatives used in other tenses, and contract verbs will continue to lengthen that final contract vowel before the tense formative. So they lengthen before a tense formative, regardless of what that tense formative is. So the verb agapao is from agapa. You add your sigma and your omega, and you get agapeso. Poieo goes to poieso. Pleirao goes to pleiroso. Okay? And then, of course, there's our friend the square of stops. And back in chapter 10, when we learned these, I said that the square of stops actually has more effects in verbs than it does in nouns. And so we're starting to see that. If you have a future tense stem that ends in a labial, doesn't matter whether it's a P, beta, or phi, when you add the sigma tense formative, that labial and sigma are rewritten as a psi. So there's a verb blepo, I see, that in the future goes to blepso. If a stem ends in a velar, kappa, gamma, or he, when you add the sigma of the tense formative, you end up with a xi. And if you have a stem ending in a dental and you add the sigma, the dental drops out and you end up with just the sigma. So what again that means, as you're looking at verbs and you are looking at the personal ending, you have to look to the left. And not only will a sigma indicate you're in the future, but a psi and a xi will also indicate that you're in the future as well. Okay? All right. Greek verbs fall into one of four different patterns. This is my own little way of organizing the information. But there's patterns 1, 2, 3, 4. We're learning pattern 1 in this chapter. Patterns 2, 3, and 4 are in chapter 20. And the significance of understanding these patterns won't really hit you until you get to chapter 20, okay? But just hang in there with me. These are all pattern 1 verbs. And in a very general sense, and I'm going to refine this in just a bit, but in a general sense, pattern 1 verbs are verbs where the present tense stem and the future tense stem are the same. In other words, many people call these the regular verbs. I don't like that designation because all Greek verbs are regular if you know all the rules. But these are the verbs that are the easiest to learn. And one of the reasons they're easy to learn is that the present tense stem and the future tense stem are the same. They look just alike. So you have luo, you have luso, okay? Those are all pattern 1 verbs. Pattern 1 verbs fall into one of 3 different categories. And it's not going to be that big of a deal right now, but on down the line, it's going to become pretty important that you know these 3 sub-patterns, okay? So make sure you have them clear in your head. Some pattern 1 words are words whose stems end in an iota or an upsilon. So this is a word like akuo. And so you have the present tense stem, aku, and in the future, you have a future tense stem, and it's the same thing. It's aku, then there's your tense formative and your ending. So you get akuso. The second sub-pattern of pattern 1 are contract verbs. Okay, so you have poie, which goes to poieo in the present. You lengthen it in the future, and you have poieso, but it's the same stem in both the present and the future. And the third sub-pattern of pattern 1 are stems ending in a stop. And so you have blep, that shows itself as blepo in the present and very regularly as blepso in the future. But the point is that those are all words where the present tense stem and the future tense stem are the same thing. Now, what I would like to do is to paint a bigger picture for you. Normally by this time in class, there's people that want to get an overall idea of where we're going in this whole Greek tense system. And so I'm going to show you some stuff about the different tenses. Now, these are not things for you to memorize, but they're just for you to be aware of the kinds of patterns that we're going to be learning, and it will help you take the different tenses and stick them in the right slot, okay? So don't try to memorize this chart, but let me just kind of walk you through where we're going in the Greek tense system, and you can see where the present and the future fit in really nicely, okay? We generally talk about 6 different Greek tense forms. Now, I include a seventh. It's the second one in this list. And so I tend to talk about 7. Most people talk about 6. But let's look at these forms. The top one, the top row, is the present. It's agapao. Agapao means I love. Okay, no big deal. You go down to the third line and you have agapeso. So how did you form the future active? Well, you lengthened the final contract vowel in this word's case, but you added a tense formative, you added the sigma, so agapeso means I will love. Okay, well, what if you wanted to take a verb, put it in past time, but make it continuous? I was loving. Well, that's the second line, and we call that the imperfect tense. So I was loving in Greek is agapon. Now, what happened with agapon? Well, the alpha lengthened to an eta, didn't it? And the endings are a little different. Okay, so we changed the beginning and the end. We changed the first vowel and we changed the ending. That's how you form the imperfect. Go down to the fourth line. Let's say you wanted to take a verb and put it in past time but undefined aspect. Well, we call that the aorist. So how do you form an aorist active? It's agapesa. Well, you lengthen the alpha to an eta, and you use a different tense formative. Instead of just sigma, you use sigma alpha. And you get agapesa, means I loved. Okay. Well, what if you want to say I have loved? Well, in Greek, we call that the perfect. How do you form the perfect active? Well, you're lengthening that initial alpha, but now the tense formative is not sigma or sigma alpha. The tense formative is kappa alpha. Agapeka means I have loved. What if you want to make a passive out of that? It's agapemai. There's no tense formative. You just have the personal ending stuck on the end. Agapemai means I have been loved. If you want to make it past time passive, undefined, that's what the aorist passive is, and it has a totally different tense formative. It's theta eta with a different ending. So agapethane means I was loved. And as strange as it may sound, the future passive is actually formed from the aorist passive form. So don't get all freaked out about that. I just wanted to kind of show you what's happening in the Greek tense system. And now we know 2 of those slots. We know the present active and we know the future active. Okay? All right. Now, that does explain, though, what's going on in your vocabulary. Remember when you started learning verbs, there was a series of different forms of the Greek word on the second line right below the definition. And I said just write them down for now if you're writing out your own vocabulary cards. But don't worry about them. Well, those are actually all those different tense forms for the verb. And so if you look at them, like if you look at the one for luo, the luo is up on the top, it's the present active. And then under normal circumstances, the second one you get is the future active, and it's listed as luso. Okay, the one after that is elusa, that's the aorist active, and so forth. But those are the different forms of the verb in their different tenses. And the first one that's always listed in the dictionary is the present, because that's the lexical form. And then generally the next one that's listed is the future. Okay, if there's a form before the future in parentheses, just ignore it for now. That's in a chapter. So the present is the first one, and generally the future active is the second one. And if you look at luo, you can see what's going on, can't you, with the stems? The present tense stem is lu, lambda upsilon, is luo, and it has the same tense stem for the future active. It's luso. Well, these are pattern 1 words, no big deal. Okay. Now, there is something else I need to say while we're looking at these different tense forms. Almost universally, people call these the different principal parts of a verb. And I remember when I was writing BBG initially, I just had trouble using that phrase, and I can't even really remember why. But I couldn't get it to fit. And so I don't call these different tense forms principal parts. Your teacher may, other books will. I call them the different tense forms of the verb. I just found it to be more descriptive and helpful. And for me, the word principal, the phrase principal parts means something different. We talk about parts of speech, nouns, adjectives, verbs. And we do talk about the different principal parts for an English verb, present past and past perfect, and present past and past perfect. But I just, for some reason, I didn't like the principal parts. And so I don't use that phrase, but your teacher might. Anyway, I call these different forms the different tense forms of a verb. Okay? All right. I want to talk about something called a root. And I actually don't talk about it in the textbook. This is just a little extra from the video. But as I was getting ready to do this talk, it just struck me really that if I could just introduce the concept of root to you as opposed to stem, it helps explain some things a little bit better in this chapter, and it gets you ready for chapter 20. And I'm also kind of a purist on these things. And in the past, I've probably used root and stem a little bit synonymously, and they're really not, and the purist in me wants to use them precisely. But anyway, for whatever be the reasons, let me give you a heads up a bit on what a root and a stem, what those two are. And it'll help you understand this chapter a little bit better, and it'll get you ready for chapter 20, okay? All right. What's a root? A root is the most basic form of a word. And a root can show itself as a verb, as a noun, as an adjective. It can go all over the place grammatically. But the root is the most basic form of a word. And in the vocabulary sections, when I have listed a word in parentheses with an asterisk in front of it, that's actually the root. Now, they've always looked like the present tense stem, and I haven't been able to talk much about it until now. But technically, that is the root. So the root of a word is the most basic form of a word, and it's what I'm giving to you in the vocabulary sections with the asterisks. The stem is what I've said all along. The stem of a verb is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense. And so we talk about a present tense stem, and we talk about now a future tense stem. And again, like up to this point, it's not been a big deal because you take luo, and the asterisk form is lu, the present tense form is lu, the future tense form is lu. They're all the same, right? Well, they're all the same in chapter 19. They're about to change in chapter 20. They're not going to be all the same. And so that's why this is an important distinction. Here's what you need to know about roots and stems. Roots are the basic form of a word. Stem is the basic form of a verb in a particular tense. And the tense stems are all formed from the root. Now I know we learned the present tense, and the future tense looks just like it, so it's easy to think that the future tense is formed from the present tense. Nothing could be further from the truth, all right? All tense stems are formed from the root. The present tense form is formed from the root. The future tense form is formed from the root, okay? That's the important distinction. Let me show you a chart I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about in the next chapter. The verbal root is the most basic form of a word. From the verbal root is formed the present tense stem. From the verbal root is formed the future tense stem. And from the verbal root is formed all the other tense stems, the aorist tense stem, the perfect. They're all formed from the root. The future is not formed from the present. And so in your vocabulary, when you memorize the asterisk form, that is the root of the verb. And so from the root lu is formed the present tense stem, which is lu, which shows itself as luo. From the root lu is formed the future tense stem, which is lu, because it's a pattern 1 verb, and you get luso. And as you will see, from the root lu is formed the aorist tense stem, lu, which shows itself as elusa, and so forth down through the system. Okay, so that's it with roots and stems. I want to go back to an earlier slide, though, and I want to state it correctly, precisely, now that you know the difference between a root and a stem. Pattern 1 verbs are verbs, and it is true that their present tense stem and their future tense stem are identical. The actual definition, though, of a pattern 1 verb is a verb where its root and its present tense stem are identical. That's the real accurate definition of pattern 1. So let's look at those 3 subcategories of pattern 1. Roots that end in an iota or upsilon are pattern 1 verbs. So you have the root aku, which shows itself in the present as akuo, and that shows itself in the future as akuso. Contract verbs are verbs whose roots end in a vowel, and so the root poiet goes to poieo in the present and poieso in the future. And roots ending in a stop are pattern 1 verbs. And so you have a root like blep that shows itself in the present as blepo and in the future very regularly as blepso. Okay, that's enough on roots and stems and the future active, all right? Let's move on to the future middle. Let's talk about the form of a future middle. A future middle uses the same stem that the future active does. In other words, the future middle uses the future active tense stem. But they're going to be different in the endings that they use. And as I said earlier, in terms of future passive, that's a totally later chapter, so we're not even going to think about future passives. So a future middle uses the future active tense stem, but it's going to be a different set of endings. And in terms of meaning, again, all the middles that I'm showing you are deponent, so all the future middles are going to have an active meaning, okay? All right, how do you form a future middle? Well, you start with the future active tense stem. You add the tense formative sigma, you add a connecting vowel, but then you add primary passive personal endings. Okay, we've seen primary passive endings in the present middle passive, but in the future we're going to use the future active tense stem, but primary passive personal endings. Now, Luo doesn't have a future middle, so we have to change the verb for the paradigm. So we use poruomai, which means I go. So the future tense stem is poru. We add the tense formative sigma, we add a connecting vowel, and we add a primary passive personal ending, so you get perusamai. You go to the full paradigm and you get perusamai, peruse, perusatai, perusamatha, perusestha, perusantai. That means I will go, you will go, he, she, it will go. And everything there is as you would expect. But they have active meanings because this particular word and all the verbs you do know so far are all deponent. And let me say something about deponent verbs. I can't remember whether I said this previously or not, but just because a verb is deponent in the present doesn't mean it's going to be deponent in the future. Now, when it comes to pattern 1 words, they almost always are. If it's deponent in the present, it's going to be deponent in the future. If it's not deponent in the present, it's not going to be deponent in the future. That's not going to be true of pattern 2, 3, and 4 verbs. Okay, but for pattern 1, it generally is. But there's always someone in the class that wants to know for sure, right? The engineering type in class. Have you identified the engineering type in your class yet? Well, there's always one. And he or she always wants to know exactly why something is the way it is. There's always 1 or 2 in every class. All right. How do you know for sure if a verb in the future is deponent or not? Well, the answer is very simple. You look it up in the lexicon. Just like we did with deponents in the present, same thing's going to happen in the future. If you're looking at a word like peruomai and you want to confirm, make sure that it's deponent in the future, you would look it up. You look at the second tense form under the entry. If that form ends in omai, then you know it's deponent in the future. So you look up peruomai. You may suspect it's deponent in the future, but you want to be sure, and that's a good thing, especially for engineers. You want to be sure. You look up the different tense forms. The second one there is perusomai. It ends in omai. Okay, this is deponent in the future. If you go to akuo, you look at the second tense form, it's akuso. It is not deponent in the future. Okay? All right. Okay, so much for deponents. Let's go on ami, and let's make sure we have ami down. Ami is technically a future middle deponent, okay? Its future tense stem is a simple epsilon, and after that, it's pretty regular in its formation. You can see the sigma, the tense formative, and your primary passive personal endings. SOMI means I will be. Again, remember, it's deponent. SA, estai, in the third person singular, there's no connecting vowel. Not sure why, but it's no big deal. You'll know what it is. Esamatha, esestha, esantai. I remember when I was learning ami, I just decided to memorize that paradigm. I'm not sure why, but it's pretty regular, so you probably don't have to, but you may want to. That's your choice. So what have we learned in chapter 19? Well, we've learned the future tense in Greek, both the future active and the future middle. Future is used, obviously, to indicate something that's going to happen in the future. And in Greek, the emphasis is on time, not on aspect. And when you translate this into English, you'll generally use the undefined aspect. I will eat, not I will be eating. It is formed with the future active tense stem. And to that you add a tense formative, which is sigma. And then you add primary endings. If it's a future active, you use primary active. If it's a future middle, you use primary passive endings. We saw that just because a verb is deponent in one tense doesn't make it deponent in another tense. But if you want to be sure, you look up the verb in a lexicon, and the second tense form listed, if it ends in omai, is a deponent verb. We learned that there are 4 patterns of verbs, and in pattern number 1, the present tense stem and the future tense stem are the same, or more properly stated, the root and the present tense stem are the same. For pattern number 1, there are 3 sub-patterns. There are roots ending in iota and upsilon. There are contract verbs, and there are roots that end with a stop. 3 very regular sub-patterns of words that shouldn't give you any trouble at all. And we added 2 more lines to the master verb chart. How do you form the future active? Well, you start with the future active tense stem, tense formative sigma, connecting vowel, primary active personal endings, and you get luso. How do you form the future middle? Well, you start with the same future active tense stem, and you add a tense formative sigma, connecting vowels, and primary middle passive endings, and you get porusomai. Okay, it's time to get going with vocabulary, but let me say something about the different tense stems before you get into the vocabulary. And again, you'll need to check with your teacher as to what he or she wants on this. My encouragement to you, especially with pattern 1 verbs, is not to memorize all the different tense stems. So much better to learn the rules. And when you learn the rules, you know that contract verb is going to be regular. You know if it's a verb like akuo, it's going to be regular. And you just figure it out. Akuo in the future, it's got to be akuso, right? So I would encourage you not to memorize all the different tense stems, especially for pattern 1 words. It'd also be kind of fun for you to go in the back of the book and look in the appendix at the chart of all of the different tense stems. And there's a lot there that you will need to memorize if, in fact, you want to memorize every different tense form of every different verb. But it's kind of fun to see them and to see where things fit. So anyway, that'd be my encouragement to you. So let's learn the vocabulary now for chapter 19.
Basileus, basileos, ha. King. Genao. I beget, give birth to, produce. Zao. I live. Iudaia, Iudaias, hey. Judea. Iudaias, Iudaia, Iudaion. As an adjective, Jewish. As a noun, Jew. Israel, ha. Israel. Karpas, karpu, ha. Fruit, crop, result. Maidzone, maidzon. Greater. Halas, hale, halon. As an adjective, whole, complete. As an adverb, entirely. Proskuneo. I worship.
Okay, and one last quick thing. I've done this in earlier chapters, but I'm having to do it again in chapter 19. And that is there's a previous words section. What I don't want you to do is to learn verbs in earlier chapters and never actually look and see what the future of those verbs is. And I want you to be able to see all the verbs you know, look at what their futures are, and then ask yourself, will I recognize this if I saw it? Will the rules explain it, or do I have to memorize it? Okay, that's what this previous words section is for. So make sure you check that out, and you'll find that for the most part, all the futures are straightforward. Okay, well, have fun with chapter 19. Well, here we are in chapter 20. And in chapter 20, we're going to be focusing on the concept of the verbal root. This chapter has a little more theory than most chapters, but I would really encourage you to spend the extra time and to really get a handle on the theory. Some teachers may not care so much about the theory, so be sure you check with them first to see what they want you to do. But I think the theory is very, very important, because if you can get the theory down, not only does it help you learn the future, but it helps you learn the entire verbal system in Greek. So I think the theory is tremendously important in this chapter. So I'd encourage you to spend a little extra time and to make sure you really have a handle on the theory. In the first edition of BBG, this was a painful chapter. I mean, it just hurt. And that's maybe why some teachers chose to stop teaching the theory. But it's all been ironed out. It's hardly harder at all anymore. It's not that hard of a chapter, okay? So I'd really encourage you to pay attention to the theory in this chapter. It basically has to do with the distinction between a root and a stem. What's the difference between a root and a stem? If you can get that, you're well on your way to understanding the Greek verbal system, at least the formation of the Greek verbal system. A root is the most basic form of a word. And in fact, from a root, you can form all different parts of speech. You can form verbs and nouns and adjectives. It's the root that carries the basic meaning of a word. It's its most basic, fundamental meaning. And when you started learning verbs, you learned the roots, didn't you? So, for example, you learned luo, the lexical form, the present active indicative is luo. And then you saw that in the entry there was a little asterisk and then lambda upsilon after it. Okay, and that's my way of indicating the verbal root. So you learned that the verbal root of luo is lu. And not that big of a deal at this point. But in a couple chapters, you're going to be learning another word called balo. And it's the word meaning I throw. And its root is beta alpha lambda, a single lambda. Now that's weird. How come you have one lambda in the root and two lambdas in the present tense stem? That's precisely the point, okay? But the root is the most basic form of a Greek word, and it's marked in the lexicon and all the way through BBG with an asterisk. A stem is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense, okay? So connect the word root with the idea of the word, and connect in the verbal system, connect the word stem with tense. The stem is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense, okay? So go back to luo. The root's lu, it goes to luo in the present and goes to luso in the future. Not a big deal. But when you get to balo, you're going to go from its root, bal, with a single lambda, to balo in the present, a double lambda. And then when you go to the future, it's going to be balo. Now forget the fact that there's no sigma there. I'll explain that in a second. But the important thing is to see it's got a single lambda in the future. Well, that's weird. How did that happen? How did you go from a single lambda in the root to a double lambda in the present? And then why is there a single lambda in the future? Okay. Well, this is the question of the relationship between roots and stems. But a root's the most basic form of the word. The stem is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense. Okay. So once you got that down, the next question is, how do they relate? How do the roots and stems relate to one another? There's actually 4 patterns that I'm going to teach you. 4 patterns of how the root is related to the present tense stem. And I'm not concerned about the other tenses right now. I'll use them for illustrations. But what I'm concerned about, that you understand what's the relationship between the root and the present tense stem. Okay, well, there's 4 patterns. There's 4 general ways the roots are related to the present tense stem. Pattern number 1 we've already learned in the previous chapter, okay? And these are stems where the stem is identical to the root, The present tense stem is identical to the root. There was no changes at all. So you have, for example, one of the subpatterns are stems ending in upsilon. So the root aku goes into the present as akuo, and it goes into the future as akuso. Okay? We also saw another subpattern of pattern 1 are contract verbs. So the root poie goes to poieo in the future and poieo in the present and poieso in the future. And we saw the third subpattern are stems ending in a stop. And so we use the square stops, and we saw, for example, blep going to blepo in the present and blepso in the future. Now that's, I don't like the word regular. I've already talked about that, but these are the regular words. These are the words that are easy to learn. You don't have to memorize all the different tense stems. You see the patterns, and it's no big deal, right? Okay. So pattern 1 is very straightforward. Patterns 2, 3, and 4, though, are a little harder. And the reason they're a little harder is that the roots that fit into these patterns are roots that were modified in the formation of the present tense stem. So these are words like balo. Well, it's a double lambda in the present, but a single lambda in the root. Patterns 2, 3, 4 are roots that were modified in the formation of the present tense stem. Now here's the problem. Because you learn the present tense system first, there's this tendency to think that the present tense form of a verb is the basic form, it's the most fundamental form, and all the other tenses are formed off of it, okay? There couldn't be anything further from the truth. And in fact, if I could have written this grammar any way I wanted, I would have never started with a present tense system, because it builds this basic misunderstanding into people's minds. The fact of the matter is the present tense stem is the most irregular of all the tenses. But because that's the only one you know, well, now with the future, I guess, you don't realize that. But because we learn the present tense system first, we tend to think it's the most basic, and it's not. The different tense stems are not formed from the present. All tense stems are formed from the root. Okay, I guess if there was one thing I could get you to see in this chapter, it's that basic truth. Now, look at this chart. This is the image that I want you to have in your mind. The most basic form of a verb is its verbal root. From the verbal root is formed the present tense stem. From the verbal root is formed the future tense stem. And in fact, from the verbal root is formed all the other tense stems. The aorist is one of the past tenses we'll learn in a couple of chapters. The future is not formed from the present. The aorist is not formed from the present. All tense stems are formed from their verbal root. That's why knowing the verbal root is so important. And so if you see a word like luo, you learn the root is lu. It goes into the present as luo, goes into the future as luso. It's going to go into the aorist as elusa. Forget the epsilon and the sigma alpha. The point is that it's lu, lambda, upsilon, and all of them. There's been no changes at all. Okay, this is pattern 1. But in patterns 2, 3, and 4, the root is being modified in the formation of the present tense stem. So the root bal with a single lambda goes to a double lambda in the present. But look what happens in the future. It goes to balo. And you go, well, what happened to the double lambda? The double lambda has nothing to do with the present. The double lambda is something that happens in the present. The future doesn't care what happens in the present, because the future is formed from the root. And so the root bal goes into the future as balo. Again, I'll explain why there's no sigma in just a bit. It goes into the aorist of epsilon. There's your beta alpha lambda once again. A lot of people learn this as the basic form being balo, and it loses, they say, a lambda in the future. That's just simply not true. You gain a lambda in the present, and the root shows itself in the other tense stems. So 3 things you need to bring out of that. I guess 4 things. Number 1 is the difference between a root and a stem. A root's the most basic form of a word. The stem is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense. Secondly, the different tense stems are formed from the root. All the tense stems actually are formed from the root. They are not formed from the present tense stem. Thirdly, the present tense is the most irregular, so you can't base anything on that. And fourthly, you just have to memorize the roots. If you learn the lexical form, that's the irregular one, and you learn the root, the rest of the verbal system is surprisingly straightforward, okay? Okay, so with all that kind of theory, let's work through the 4 different patterns that we have in forming the different tense stems, okay? Pattern number 1, again, just by way of review. Pattern number 1, and I'm going to state this one completely correctly now. Pattern number 1 are roots that are not modified in the formation of their present tense stem. That's the right way to think about it. Roots not modified in the formation of the present tense stem. And we had our 3 sub-patterns. We had stems ending in iota or upsilon. We had contract stems, and we had stems ending in a stop. Okay, so those are the ones that you don't have to memorize at all. Okay. Number 2, and we're going to go from kind of one end of the spectrum all the way to the other. Pattern number 2 are verbs that actually have totally different roots being used in the formation of their different tense stems. So these are the ones that are the most different, okay? And these are the ones that you'll just memorize. It's just easiest to make different vocabulary cards for these. Here are the 3 that you're going to need to know for this chapter. You've already learned erchomai, means I come, and it's built from the root erch. Okay, no big deal. When you get to the future, though, you're going to memorize it as eliusamai. You're going to go, where did that come from? I mean, how did you get from erchomai to eliusamai? And the answer is, you didn't. Well, how'd you get from erch to eliusamai? You didn't. Erchomai actually uses a totally different root in the formation of its future. It uses the root eliuth. And the root ends in a dental, the theta drops off before the sigma, and you get eliusamai. So erchomai means I come, eliusamai means I will come. These totally different roots. You also know the word lego, means I say, it's from the root leg, but its future is ero. Well, how did you get, now you know not to ask that, right? See, lego uses a totally different root in the formation of the future. It uses the root er. And again, there's no sigma, and I'll tell you why in a bit, but it's a totally different root, and you just have to memorize it, that arrow is the future of Lego. There's no rule that lets you move between them smoothly. So that's pattern 2, and what I would just do is make 6 different vocabulary cards, okay, 1 for the present and 1 for the future, each of these words, and then make sure you memorize the different roots, which each of the tense stems. Now that's the easiest way to handle those. So, pattern 1 were the blissfully regular ones. Pattern 2 are the not so ones on the other end of the spectrum, the ones that use different roots. Okay, let's go on to pattern 3. Pattern 3 is actually a subset of pattern 4, but pattern 4 is the one that is difficult, and pattern 4 is the one that some teachers prefer not to teach their students, but all teachers want their students to learn pattern 3. So I made it a separate pattern. Pattern 3 are called the liquid futures. The liquid futures. Now what's a liquid? A liquid is a stem that ends in lambda, mu, nu, or rho. These are 4 sounds that you make by letting the sound come out of your mouth or your nose, and are actually the true liquids. And are called nasals, but they behave the same way. So put them in one category called liquids. A liquid stem is a stem that ends in a lambda, mu, nu, rho. The 4 consonantal sounds you can make over an extended period of time. Okay. What is unusual about these liquid consonants? Well, the main thing is they have a different tense formative in the future. Take a look at the chart. The liquid future is formed by using the future active tense stem plus a tense formative, but in the case of liquids, the tense formative is epsilon sigma. And then you have the connecting vowel and primary active personal ending. So it looks all regular, right? Well, look at the example. The lexical form of this word is meno. Okay, the future tense stem is men. You add the epsilon sigma tense formative, your connecting vowel, and then the personal ending. But the problem is, in some cases, sigma doesn't like to stand between vowels. It's called an intervocalic sigma. It drops out, and the epsilon and omicron contract. And so you end up with menumen. So what you have is no sigma, because it's dropped out, and you have the contraction. Menumen is the future form of meno. Okay, so this is an example of liquid futures. When you go to the actual paradigm, the future active is down the left-hand side. It's meno, menes, mene, menumen, meneta, menusi with the new movable. Now, there's a couple of things that should stand out to you. What are they? And in fact, on the far right-hand column, I included the present active of meno so you can look at them. Well, one of the things you're going to notice is the accent's different. In the future of a liquid verb, it's always a circumflex and it's always over the contracted syllable. And in the first and second person plural, you can really see the contractions, don't you? But here's actually the main problem you're going to have. What does meno look like? Well, it looks just like the present active indicative of an epsilon contract, doesn't it? Look at the poio column. Meno, poio. Menes, poies. Mene, poie. All the way down the line. In other words, the forms are identical. The forms of a future active liquid and a present active epsilon contract are identical. So the question, of course, is how are you going to tell them apart? And there's a couple of ways. It's not that hard. The easiest way is just to memorize your vocabulary. If you looked at, let's say, menumen, first person plural, if you look at that, you may think, oh, that's an epsilon contract. Well, that would be meneo. And you go, wait a minute, I never memorized a form meneo. If you look it up in a dictionary, there is no form meneo. That would be your first clue that menumen is not from an epsilon contract. Your second clue is what's the consonant right before the vowel? It's a nu, it's a liquid. This is from meno, this is from a liquid verb, so menumen is going to be a future. In terms of keeping the future of a liquid separate from a present, it's mostly an issue of the circumflex and the contraction in those two cases. So that is the future active indicative of a liquid verb. When you switch over into the future middle, there's no surprises here. Everything is as you would expect it. You still are going to have the tense formative of an epsilon sigma. The sigma is going to drop out, and so you're going to have your contractions. So the future tense stem, men, plus the tense formative epsilon sigma, connecting vowel, and then primary passive personal endings. And you get the sigma dropout, you get the contraction, and you end up with menumetha. When you look at the full paradigm, you can work right down it. Menumai, mene, menetai, menumetha, menesta, menuntai. You can see the contractions all the way down. And so in the future middle, it's easier to keep the future separate from the present middle. Now there is one other change that happens in liquids, and I've given you some of the reasons. Later on, I'll give you some of the other reasons. But sometimes what happens in liquids is that you're going to have stem changes. And sometimes it's like a double lambda going to a single lambda. So apostello goes to the future as apostello. Sometimes you have an iota asserted, and iro goes to aro. It's the root is alpha rho, so it's inserted in the present. And you have things like lego going to ero. So in the future of liquids, you're also going to sometimes have stem changes, but there generally shouldn't be a problem as long as you understand that they're going to be changing from case to case. Okay, so those are our first three patterns, okay? Pattern number one is the, quote, regular ones. Pattern number two are the weird ones. We're using different roots. And then pattern number three are the futures. Okay, we now come to the fourth pattern. And this is the pattern that's the hardest to get. And so again, check with your teacher, and he or she may not want you bothering with all of this stuff. because some of the rules are a little complicated. But I really encourage you to listen through this part of the lecture. And even if you're just going to memorize these particular words, if you can see the patterns at work in them, it makes the memory work a lot easier. And I think at the end of the day, you'll find it better just to learn the patterns and to be ready for them. Of course, it's kind of like the modifications that happen in third declension. In the third declension, if you learn the nominative singular and the stem, everything else is pretty regular, right? Well, this same way happens with most of the words in pattern 4, that if you learn the present tense stem and the verbal root, it's not that hard. Again, as long as you understand that it's the verbal root that is being used in the formation of all the other tense stems. If you can get that into your head, even pattern 4 is not that very hard. Okay, pattern 4 are verbs that modify the root in the formation of the present tense stem. Okay, the root's actually modified, and not in nice, neat, easy ways like pattern 1, or in totally different roots like in pattern 2. The root actually is modified in the formation of the present tense stem. But again, let me talk through some of the basic sub-patterns of this, and you'll see how it works. The first sub-pattern for this are roots that end in a stop. Now, some of these fit in pattern 1, but others fit in pattern number 4. Let me give you an example here. Let's use baptizo. In this chapter, we're going to learn the verb baptizo. Obviously means I baptize. And we're going to learn its root as baptid. Now, you may look at that and go, well, how'd you get from baptid to baptizo? Well, there's reasons for it. But perhaps at this point, you don't need to know the reasons why. You just need to know that the present tense form is baptizo and is from the root baptid. What's going to happen in the future of baptizo? Well, remember, it doesn't go from the present tense to the future tense. It goes from the root to the future tense. What happens when you put a sigma on a stem ending in a dental? Dental drops off. And so you have the very regular future baptizo. Now, if you try to go from baptizo to baptizo, it's going to be confusing. But you're not going to do that, are you? You would never go from the present tense stem to the future tense stem, would you? No, of course not. Never. What you do is go from the root to the present and from the root to the future. So any verb that you learn, a lexical form ending in idzo or in fact adzo, alpha, zeta, omega, are actually stems that end in a dental. So you learn the lexical form, you learn the root, and after that it's all regular. You also are going to learn the word tarasso. We call them aso verbs, obviously, for how they end. What you're going to see is that aso verbs have roots that actually end in a velar. So you're going to memorize tarasso from the root tarak with a he. Well, what happens to any velar when you add the sigma of the future? It's rewritten as a xi, isn't it? So tarasso is going to go to taraxo. Well, that actually doesn't do that. Tarak goes to tarasso in the present. Tarak goes to taraxo in the future. Absolutely regular if you know the roots, right? Okay, so that wasn't that big of a deal. Well, let's go to the second sub-pattern then for pattern 4. These are words that in the present tense stem have double consonants. A word you're going to learn in a couple of chapters is verb balo. It means I throw. And you're going to learn it as balo, and then the root is bal. It's a single lambda. So in the formation of the present tense stem, the root doubled the final consonant. And what's going to happen when you get into the future of this word, it's going to go to balo. In other words, it's going to go to a single lambda. And because lambda is what kind of consonant? What kind of consonant? Right, it's a liquid, isn't it? So the sigma's not there. So balo is a liquid future, but there's only one lambda. That's the point. Why is there only one lambda? Because this root only has one lambda. The root doubled the final consonant in the formation of the present tense stem, but it's not going to do that in the future or in the other tense stems. So these kinds of words are pretty regular too, aren't they, for you? Okay, the third sub-pattern, it's not that hard, is it? See? The third sub-pattern for pattern 4 is some words actually add letters to the root in order to form the present tense stem. And they can add an iota, or they can add sigma kappa, and sometimes iota sigma kappa. Let's look at a couple of examples. There is a root R, alpha rho, that in the formation of the present tense stem added an iota, and then the iota went between the alpha and the rho. No big deal. And you have I rho, okay? When you go to the future, though, because the future is not built from the present tense stem, but from the verbal root, you only have alpha rho. What kind of character is an alpha rho? It's a liquid. That's why there's no sigma. The future of I rho is a rho. Okay? But the point is there's no iota. How come? The iota was added in the formation of the present tense stem. The verbal root goes unmodified into the future. Okay? All right. What about the word gnosko? Okay, so the word means I know. It comes from the root gno, gamma nu omega. Now, there is an iota between the gamma and the nu in the present. That's something different. Just ignore that. The point is, it's gnosko in the present, but because the root is gno, you go into the future and it's gnosomai. All right? Now, this word happens to not be deponent in the present, and it is deponent in the future. But other than that, you can see what happened. The sigma kappa was added in the formation of the present tense stem, but it wasn't added anywhere else, and so you have no sigma kappa in the future. You just have the sigma of the tense formative. Okay, again, the point here is that these are regular things, and you can start seeing why in a word like iro, do you want to memorize it? Well, again, I would say if you know that the present tense form is iro and the root is r, alpha rho, you don't need to memorize anything else. If you know that the lexical form is gnosko and the root is gno, you certainly memorize the future deponent other than it is deponent, and that may trip you up a little. But again, the point is these are regular ways in which the root is modified in the formation of the present tense stem. Now, how hard was that? Well, it may be a bit overwhelming and that there's a lot of information, but I think as you review this chapter, you'll find that it's not that big of a deal, okay? So talk to your teacher, ask what he or she wants you to do about pattern number 4. Patterns 1, 2, and 3, everyone's going to have to know. Okay, hey, we're almost near the end of the chapter. A couple of odds and ends here. I guess first number odds and ends is just that challenge, and that is, are you going to memorize rules, or are you going to memorize tense forms and all the stuff that goes with that? If you choose just to memorize, for example, iro, aro, that kind of stuff, just make sure you know the root and watch the patterns. Be aware of the patterns. Notice how that there are some words that end in double consonants that don't have double consonants elsewhere. Be aware of the patterns. It will really help you in your memory work. But I just prefer to reduce memory work and learn a couple of rules. That's just how I work. So anyway, that'd be number 1, odds and end. Number 2, odds and end, has to do with compound verbs. A compound verb is when you put a preposition and a simple verb together. So ek means out, balo means throw, so ek balo means you throw out, okay? In the formation of the future of compound verbs, the verbal part changes just like the singular, the simple form does. So ekbalo is going to form its future as ekbalo, just as balo goes to the future balo, okay? And the third thing, again, we've seen this, is you have to watch this whole issue of deponent verbs, because some verbs are going to be deponent in one tense, but not deponent in another tense. Deponency can change depending upon the roots and different things like that. So just be aware that they change, okay? All right. So, what did we learn in this chapter? Let's go to the summary. Well, we learned what a root and a stem was. The root is the most basic form of a word. The stem is the basic form of a verb in a particular tense. We learned that stems are formed from the root. Stems are not formed from the present stem. And there's 4 patterns of how the root moves into the present tense stem. Pattern 1 is that they're identical. The root is not modified in the formation of the present tense stem. Pattern 2 is totally different roots are used in the formation of the different tense stem. Pattern 3 are liquids, and the root moves for the most part smoothly into the present tense stem, but the tense formative is epsilon sigma. The sigma drops out and you get some contractions that you have to be aware of. And then pattern 4 is the root itself is modified in the formation of the present tense stem, but the root for the most part is going to go directly into the other tense stems unmodified. So examples are idzo words, which are really roots ending in a dental. Aso words, verbs, are verbs whose roots end in a velar, and they're going to behave perfectly regularly after that. We saw some roots go into the present tense and double the final consonant, and all the other tense stems, the consonant single. And we saw that some roots are going to add in letters like iota or sigma kappa in the formation of the different stems. And there were a few odds and ends as well, compound verbs and watching deponent forms. And then, of course, there's the master verb chart. And in this chapter, we learned the liquid future active, which is formed with the future active tense stem, the tense formative epsilon sigma, connecting vowels, primary active personal endings, and so you get minnow. And we learned the liquid future middle, which is formed from the future active tense stem, epsilon sigma tense formative, connecting vowels, but primary middle passive personal endings, and you end up with menumai. Now, there's a couple of places in the grammar you're going to want to go and spend some good time just looking over things, okay? The first is in a section called Check It Out, right before the vocabulary section in chapter 20. And what I've done is that I've listed all the verbs you know. I've listed their roots, I've listed their present tense form, and their future tense form. And what you need to do is just go through the list. And the basic question you're asking yourself is, one, do I understand how it's all working? Do I see how the root's modified to form the present tense stem, but it goes smoothly into the future? Okay, do you see that? And then you're going to have to ask yourself, do I just need to memorize any of these tense forms? For example, when it comes to gnosko, you may want to memorize gnosomai in the future because it's deponent. But look through that list and just see if you understand it all. There's another section in the appendix that lists all the verbs that you're going to learn in the entire book. And it lists all their different tense forms in all of them. And what I've done is that I went through and the tense forms that I think you probably need to memorize, I put in blue. And you will be pleasantly surprised, I think, by seeing how little blue there actually is in that chart. But you may want to peruse through that chart. Now, again, there's other tenses there, so don't let that freak you out. But you can just look around at them and get familiar with that chart, because you'll be going back to that chart over and over again.
Iro. I raise, take up, take away. Apokteno. I kill. Apostello. I send, send away. Baptizo. I baptize, dip, immerse. Gnosko. I know, come to know, realize, learn. Glossa, glosses, hey. Tongue, language. Egero. I raise up, wake. Ekbalo. I cast out, send out. Eke. There, in that place. Krino. I judge, decide, prefer. Laos, lau, ha. People, crowd. Meno. I remain, live. Horao. I see, notice, experience. Sophia, Sophias, hey. Wisdom. Stama, stamatos, ta. mouth. Sozo, I save, deliver, rescue.
Well, here we are in chapter 21. And in chapter 21, we're going to learn a new tense. It's called the imperfect tense. The imperfect is used to describe a past action with continuous aspect. In other words, we're going to learn in this chapter how to say, I was reading. Okay? All right. Just real quickly with English. English has three principal parts you remember. The second principal part is the past form of the verb. Eat, ate, eaten. So ate is the past form of the verb. And if you want in English to make a past tense continuous, we use a helping verb. So ate goes to was eating. Okay? Well, when it comes to Greek, it's actually more specific than that. Greek actually has two distinctly different tenses, one for past time undefined aspect and another totally different tense for past time continuous aspect. You remember in Greek in the present tense, a present tense Greek form can be both undefined and continuous, but when it comes to past time, they actually have two different tenses. So, if you wanted to say something in the past time with an undefined aspect, like I read, then that's the aorist tense, and we're going to learn that in the next chapter. But if you want to say something in past time but make it continuous aspect, like I was reading, that is this chapter, and that is the imperfect tense. All right. The imperfect tense is, in terms of meaning, usually past time. Now remember we said with the present tense that it's usually present but not always. Same thing with the imperfect. The imperfect in Greek describes an action that usually occurs in the past, but it's always going to be continuous. So if it's active, it's going to be I was loving. And if it's passive, it's I was being loved. Got to put the participle of being in there, don't you? So I was loving or I was being loved. That's the meaning of the imperfect. In terms of how to form the imperfect, there's two new things that we're going to learn. There's going to be an augment and there's going to be secondary endings. Let me just introduce augment just real briefly, and then I'll go into more detail about it in a little bit. The augment is basically a prefix that you add to the beginning of the Greek verb that puts it into past time. And so in the charts, you're going to see a form like eluon. Well, that initial epsilon before the lambda is the augment, is what puts it into past time and is part of how we form the imperfect tense in Greek. It's, in a sense, it's kind of like the ed we add as a suffix on English verbs. So if you're going to take a verb that forms its past time regularly, like kick, well, you'll add an ed onto it. So kick goes to kicked. Okay, it's somewhat the same sense. The augment is a prefix we add to the beginning of the verb, such as the epsilon in eluon. Okay, so that's what an augment is. What is a secondary tense? Well, I'm glad now that you kind of know what an augment is, I can finally tell you what a primary tense is and what a secondary tense is. You remember in the previous chapter I said I couldn't define primary till later. Well, now it's the later. Okay. A primary tense is a tense that is not augmented. And we now know two of those, right? The present and the future. Okay, so a primary tense is an unaugmented tense, and it therefore uses primary personal endings. The secondary tenses are the tenses that do use an augment, and secondary tenses use secondary personal endings. Okay, so there, I can finally tell you the difference between primary and secondary. When you think about secondary endings, your mind goes, I'm sure, to that quadrant of 4 and in our master personal ending chart. And what we're going to do in this chapter is that we're going to learn the third and fourth, in other words, the last of the personal endings in this chart. So when we're done with this chapter, you're going to know all 4 quadrants. You're going to know all 24 personal endings. Now, in some of the other tenses, there might be some little tweaks on these, but for the vast majority of cases, these are the personal endings that you need to know. Primary, active, and passive, and then secondary, active, and passive. And let me say now that one of the advantages of learning primary and secondary tense is that you get a double check. When you see an ending and you think it is going to be a secondary ending, that means the tense is going to be augmented. And so one of your double checks is you're looking at your endings, you go, oh, I think that's a secondary tense, secondary personal ending. Just go right to the beginning of the word and see if it's augmented, okay? Now, sometimes the augment can be hidden and be a little hard to find, but that's just a basic double check you need to do. If it's a secondary personal ending, go find the augment somewhere, all right? All right. Another way to look at this quadrant is to replace the terms I've been using with the tenses and voices that we've kind of connected with these endings. In other words, the primary active personal endings are what we learned with the present active. The primary passive personal endings are those that we learned with the present passive. The secondary active endings are the ones that we're learning in conjunction with the imperfect active, and the secondary passive endings are those that we are learning in conjunction with the imperfect middle passive. So maybe that will give you a little extra help on what this quadrant's all about. Okay, let's go to the master verb chart and let's look at some charts and memorize some endings. Okay, how do you form the imperfect active indicative? It's very easy. You take an augment, you add the present tense stem, so there's no new tense stems to learn in this chapter. That's nice. You're going to have a connecting vowel, and then you're going to have secondary active personal endings. So, for example, you can have an augment epsilon, the present tense stem lu, connecting vowel, and then men, which is the first person plural, secondary active ending. Does that look familiar? Yeah, it's the same as the primary ending, isn't it? We'll get back to that in a second. Anyway, you end up with eluomen. Okay, so there is your first person plural imperfect active indicative form of luo. Look at the full paradigm and you get eluon, elus, elua, eluomen, eluata, eluon. You go over and you can see that the true secondary active personal endings are nu, sigma, nothing with a nu movable, men, te, nu. When you combine that with the connecting vowels, you end up with on, s, e, amen, ete, on. Now you notice the first person singular and the third person plural are identical. Now you may think, oh, that's going to be so confusing, but actually, in context, it's not confusing at all. I don't know the numbers, but my guess is there's a lot more third person plurals than there are first person singulars in the imperfect. But all that you really have to do is to do what you're doing all along, and that is when you have a verb, you look at its personal ending and you double check it against the subject, right? You are doing that, right? Yeah, good. And so when you see a form like eluon, and you're going to go back, if the subject's first person, then you know that eluon is the first person singular. But if you double check the subject and it's not a first person singular, then you know that eluon is a third person plural. So just do your normal double checking and it won't be, those two forms won't be confusing to you. All right. Let's spend a little bit of time comparing the primary and the secondary endings here in the active. And again, take a look at these charts and just keep asking yourself, okay, what's similar, what's different, what am I going to be able to see easily, what's going to confuse me? And just spend some time in the chart and you'll be able to figure this out pretty easily. First person singular is pretty straightforward. In the primary, there's no personal ending. In the secondary, there's nu. In the second person singular, they're the same, aren't they? Now, the thing that's different is that in the primary tenses, that epsilon, which is a connecting vowel, lengthened epsilon iota. But this is why I wanted you to memorize in the primary personal endings that the true ending is really a sigma. That way, when you get to secondary, you see that it's the same thing. In the third person singular, in the primary, the ending is iota. It's nothing in the secondary. In the plural, in the first and second person, they're identical. And again, so when you see a men and a te, you need to go see if there's an augment so you can tell whether it's primary or secondary. And in the third person plural, you have nc in the primary and a simple nu in the secondary. So make sure you spend some time looking at that chart and trying to find out what forms may or may not give you some problems. Okay, enough for the imperfect active. Let's switch to the imperfect middle passive. How do you form an imperfect middle passive? I'm glad you asked. Here's how you do it. You start with an augment. You have the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, and secondary passive personal endings. So the augment is going to be epsilon. In the case of Lu, the present tense stem is Lu. The connecting vowel is there. And then mitha is your first person plural, secondary passive personal ending. And so you get eluamitha. Take a look at the full paradigm and you get eluamein, eluu, eluita, eluamitha, eluista, eluanta. The true personal endings for the secondary middle passive are main, sa, ta, mitha, stha, nta, which when you combine them with the connecting vowel form amain, u, eta, amitha, estha, anta. Now, as you look at those different forms, you can see that the personal ending has come over with no modification at all, except in the second person singular. But we're used to problems in the second person singular in the passive, aren't we? What is the true personal ending, second person singular, for the primary tenses? It is psi, isn't it? Sigma, alpha, iota. And the sigma drops out and you have contractions. Same thing's going on in the secondary tenses. The second person singular passive is sa. The sigma is intervocalic with a connecting vowel. It drops off. And the epsilon and omicron contract to u. So apart from that, everything is very straightforward. As you compare the active and the secondary again, you can see similarities and differences. Make sure that you pay close attention to these. First person singular, the primary is my, the secondary is main. Not that hard, both three letters, both beginning with a mu. In the second person singular, it's psi in the primary and sa in the secondary. And one thing that's really important to notice here is that the alpha iota is a sign of the primary. The omicron is a sign of the secondary, because look what happens in third singular. The primary is tai, the secondary is ta. Okay, it's like the alpha, iota, and the omicron are swapping places. In the plural, first and second person are the same. And then when you get to third plural, it's ntai, there's the alpha, iota, and in the secondary, it's nta, and there's your omicron. So again, spend time on there and make sure you can see what is going to be easy for you to parse and what might trip you up, and pay close attention to those. Okay, well that's enough for charts for a little bit. Let's center in on the augment. I gave you just a real basic understanding of the augment, and there's actually 3 rules connected with the augment, so let's learn those now. Rule number 1 is that if the verb begins with a consonant, the augment is that initial epsilon. So luo goes to eluan. That's what we've been seeing. It's sometimes called a syllabic augment because the augment adds an extra syllable to the word. The second rule for augments is that if the verb begins with a vowel, that vowel is lengthened to form the augment. And sometimes this is called a temporal augment because the long vowel takes a little bit longer to say than a short vowel. But anyway, the rule 2 is that if the word begins with a vowel, that vowel is going to be lengthened. Alphas are going to lengthen to etas. And so, for example, agapao in the imperfect goes to agapon. Epsilon's lengthened to etas. And so erotao goes to eroton in the imperfect. And omicron's lengthened to omegas. So that's the second rule. The third rule has to do with the diphthong. And diphthongs are a little bit of a pain in the neck, but not too much, because they don't always do what you think they're going to do. The basic rule with an augment is that if a word begins with a diphthong, then the first letter of the diphthong is going to lengthen. And then if the second letter of the diphthong is an iota, it will subscript. And so you get something like aiteo, and the alpha lengthens to an eta, and then the iota subscripts underneath it, and you get atun. All right? Now, the problem with these initial diphthongs is sometimes they don't do anything. They just kind of sit there. And initial epsilon, upsilon diphthongs often show no change at all when they're, in a sense, augmented. They're identical in form. So sometimes you could have a word like eucharisteo that will go to, it's a hard one to say, eucharistun there. But other times a word like heurisco stays with the initial epsilon, upsilon. So you've got to look for other things to tell that you're in the imperfect. So those are the three rules for the diphthong. Begins with a consonant, you have the epsilon. If it begins with a vowel, the vowel lengthens. If it begins with a diphthong, the first vowel of the diphthong sometimes lengthens, and if the second vowel of the diphthong is in the iota, it subscripts. But other times, nothing happens at all, okay? All right. So that's how we form the imperfect. We've got an augment, we've got a present tense stem, we have a connecting vowel, and then we have secondary endings. And by the way, let me say, this is the one thing that I do differently from other people in listing out the tense forms. People don't generally list the imperfect when you list out the, akuo, and then the future akuso, and the aorist, and so forth. I just found it helpful to put the imperfect in there so that for beginners in Greek, you will know for sure what that diphthong looks like. I mean, not diphthong, the initial augment looks like. And so what I do is that if a word occurs in the imperfect in the New Testament, I include it in the listings. I just put a parenthesis around it. Okay, so that's why I tend to have 7 different forms of Greek verbs where most people have 6. But anyway, it's just a little something I found that will help people along the way. Okay, let's just spend a little more time reviewing the master personal ending chart. Okay, we now know those last 2 quadrants for the secondary active and the secondary passive. And let's just go through them just to make sure they're clear. They are nu, sigma, nothing with a nu movable, men, te, nu. With the connecting vowel, here comes the cheerleaders, on, s, e. Amen, etta, on, with luo, eluon, elues, elue, eluomen, eluita, eluon. What are the secondary middle passive personal endings? They are main, sa, ta, mitha, st, nta. Combined with a connecting vowel, they are amen, u, eta, amatha, esta, anta. With luo, they are eluamen, eluu, eluita, eluamatha, eluesta, eluanta. Okay, that's enough on those personal endings. About 4 odds and ends and we're done with the chapter. Odds and end number 1 is, if a verb is deponent in the present, it will always be deponent in the imperfect. Now we saw in the future that's not the case, but in the imperfect it's always the case. How come? All right, if you remember the rule, deponency is an issue of the tense stem, not so much the tense. And the imperfect uses the present tense stem. So the present and the imperfect are using the same stem. So if a verb is deponent in the present, it's going to be deponent in the imperfect. If it's not deponent in the present, it won't be deponent in the imperfect. Okay, so that was straightforward. Second odds and end has to do with parsing. And this is one of those things that I found that I was doing and I forgot to teach to students this. It's just one of those things that it's a habit I developed. And what I do when I look at a verb, an inflected form of a verb, and if it doesn't just jump out to me right away what it is, and I have to start dissecting and pretend I'm Sherlock Holmes and looking for clues, what I find myself doing is that I look at the tense stem, and I ask myself, is this the form I memorized? Now, what I'm really asking is this tense stem the present tense stem? Okay? If the tense stem I'm looking at is in fact the present tense stem, then I know that I'm in the present or the imperfect. But if the tense stem that I'm looking at in the inflected form is not the present tense stem, it's not the lexical form of the word I memorized, then I know I am outside of the present and the imperfect system. Now, as we learn other tenses and other moods, this becomes more and more important. So I would encourage you to do that. You're looking at an inflected form, you're not sure what it is, go look, and you got endings, you can be looking for augments, you can be looking for tense formatives, but also look at the tense stem and ask yourself, Is this the present tense stem? Is this the form of the verb that I memorized? That will tell you whether you're inside the present and the imperfect, or whether you're possibly outside of it. Okay, it's just one of those things. It doesn't always tell you what it is, but it gives you good hints. Okay, all right. Second odds and end. Third odds and end has to do with augmenting compound verbs. Let's say we have a compound verb like ekbalo. Okay, ek is the preposition that means out. Balo is to throw. Ekbalo means I throw out. Okay. Where does the augment go in a compound verb? Well, it can't go with the preposition because prepositions can't tell time, and the augment is telling you that it's past time, right? So on compound verbs, you augment the verbal part of the compound. In other words, on ekbalo, the augment's gonna go right between the preposition and the verbal part because you have to augment the verbal part, okay? So when it comes to compound verbs, the augment goes between the preposition and the simple form of the verb. And so, for example, you have a word like katabino, all right? If you have katabino, you're going to put the augment between the alpha of the preposition kata and the verbal part bino. And you end up with katebainan. Now, if you're thinking and you look at the form katebainan, what's wrong? Well, I thought alphas and epsilons were going to contract or something, right? Well, actually, what happens in compound verbs is that if the preposition ends with a vowel, that vowel generally drops out. So there is no contraction at all. So it's katebainan. All right. The exception to that is that the preposition ends in an iota. And an iota is a very strong sound in English. It just didn't want to go away. So you have a verb like peripateo. And when you add in your augment, it's periepatun. In other words, both the iota and the epsilon are going to stay. The iota is not going away. That's just a characteristic of the iota. The other kind of odd thing that happens is that if you have a compound verb where the preposition is ek, when you put the augment between the kappa and the verbal part, the kappa is rewritten as a xi. So ekbalo goes to exebelon. All right, that's just a characteristic of the preposition ek. Now, there's reasons for it, but I don't think you care at this point what those reasons are. They're in my morphology. So anyway, odds and ends. Final odds and ends is contract verbs. And the best thing to do, again, with contract verbs is simply spend some time looking at the chart and asking yourself, if I saw all these forms, would I recognize them? Do I understand what's going on? But will any of these forms trip me up? So spend some time in the chart and just look at the forms and ask, do they make sense, okay? And as you're going down this chart, second and third person may be a little trouble, especially for alpha contracts. Agapa, well, what's that? Well, that looks like a nominative plural feminine noun or something, doesn't it? Well, it's a third person singular of an alpha contract. A playruse kind of throw you a little as well. But anyway, just spend some time in the charts and get to know what you're going to recognize and what you're not. And now, the last paradigm of this chapter is the paradigm for Amy. This is the past form of Amy. And it's probably easiest just to memorize these forms. Amain is I was. Ace is you were. Notice that it's smooth breathing with a circumflex. You don't want to confuse this with a relative pronoun. Third person is ain with a smooth breathing and circumflex, but you already memorized this back in one of the earlier chapters, but ain means he, she, or it was. In the first person plural, you have alternate forms. You can either have amen or ametha. Both mean we were. Amen occurs 8 times in the New Testament, ametha 5 times. So just alternate form, same meaning. Eta is you plural were, y'all were. And asen is they were. All right, very good. Let's look in summary of what we've learned in this chapter. Well, we've learned the imperfect. The imperfect indicates a continuous action, normally in past time. It's formed with an augment, the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, and secondary endings. And we learned the 3 rules for the augment. Rule number 1 is that if the word begins with a consonant, we augment it by putting an epsilon on it. It's called the syllabic augment. Rule 2, if the verb begins with a vowel, we lengthen it. That's called a temporal augment. Alphas and epsilons go to etas, omicrons go to omegas. And rule 3 has to do with verbs beginning with a diphthong. And we do one of two things with verbs beginning with diphthongs. One is that we will lengthen the first letter, the first vowel of the diphthong. And if the second vowel of the diphthong is in the iota, it will subscript. Or if the verb begins with a diphthong, we may do nothing at all and just let it sit. And we learn secondary personal endings. In the active, the true endings are nu, sigma, nothing, men, te, nu, and they show themselves with a connecting vowel as on, s, e, amen, eta, on, eluan, elues, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluan. And the middle passive endings are main, sa, ta, mitha, stha, nta. With the connecting vowels, they are amen, u, eta, amitha, estha, anta, eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamitha, eluestha, eluanta. And then we learn some odds and ends. We learn that if a verb is deponent in the present, it will also be deponent in the imperfect. We learned in terms of parsing to look at the tense stem and ask ourselves if this is the same tense stem as the present tense stem. And we learned with compound verbs that you augment the verbal part of the compound. And if the preposition that formed the compound verb ends in a vowel, that vowel generally drops out before the augment. Iota is the exception. And if the compound verb is formed with ek, the kappa is rewritten as a xi when you add the augment. Verbs are pretty regular. Third singular was the only one that might give us some problems. And finally, we memorize the paradigm for ame. Amen, ace, ain, amen or ametha, eta, asen. And finally, the master verb chart. How do you form the imperfect active? Well, now we now know what that aug means, don't we? Redupe will wait a few more chapters. How do you form the imperfect active? Well, you have an augment, the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, secondary active personal endings, and you get eluan. How do you form the imperfect middle passive? Is with an augment, the present tense stem, connecting vowel, and secondary middle passive personal endings, and you get eluamen. Okay, good job there. Before we get to the vocabulary, there's one other thing I want to say, and that is you may want to look at the last paragraph in the advanced information. This is one of those things where I wasn't sure whether to put it in advanced information or put it in the textbook, but it's kind of important. There's a thing called the preparatory use of there, and all it means is that sometimes you're going to find a me in a sentence, and you're not going to be able to translate it. And what this means is that you can say there, T-H-E-R-E. So esten can mean there is. It'll get you out of some translation problems. Okay, very good. Let's take a look at the vocabulary for chapter 21.
Akalutheo. I follow, accompany. Didasko. I teach. Eperotao. I ask for, question, demand of. Erotao. I ask, request, entreat. Thelo. I will, wish, desire, enjoy. Peripateo. I walk around, live. Synagoge, synagoges, hey. Synagogue, meeting. Pharisaios, Pharisaiu, ha. Pharisee. Chronos, chronu, ha. Time.
In chapter 22, we're going to learn a new tense called the aorist tense. Now, in the last chapter, we learned the imperfect tense, and the imperfect was used to describe a continuous action normally occurring in the past time. The aorist is a tense we use to describe an undefined action that normally occurred in the past time. So the difference between the imperfect and the aorist in terms of meaning is a difference of aspect, not of time, okay? Okay, a couple things about English before we get into the aorist tense. In English, we have two basic ways that we form our principal parts. One formation we call the regular or the weak. And these are verbs that when it comes to forming the past time, we add an ed onto it. Okay, that's the regular formation. And so study goes to studied, kick goes to kicked, that kind of thing. We also have another formation called the irregular formation, also called the strong. And if a verb follows this pattern, in order to form the past tense, that it's going to be some irregular, it's going to be some major change. So, for example, eat goes to ate, okay? So we have those two different formations in English, the regular or the weak, and the irregular and the strong, all right? Now, what's important to notice in these is that these two different patterns only affect the form of the verb. They have no effect on the meaning at all, okay? If eat was a regularly formed verb and the past tense would therefore be eated, I guess, then eated and ate would mean exactly the same thing, okay? So we have these two different ways to form the past tense in English, but they are differences that only affect form, not affect meaning. We're going to see the same kind of thing when it comes to the Greek verbs, okay? All right. In this chapter, we are going to learn the aorist. And again, as I said earlier, in terms of meaning, the aorist describes an undefined action normally occurring in past time. And we're going to use the simple past tense of the English verb to translate it. So you would go from love to loved. You wouldn't say was loving or anything that's continuous. Just use the simple past form of the English verb to translate the aorist. So in terms of meaning, that's easy. In terms of how you form an aorist, there's actually two different ways. There's two formations that, in a sense, kind of roughly parallel what we do in English. There's a first aorist and a second aorist. The first aorist is generally viewed as the regular formation, and we're going to learn that in the next chapter. But in this chapter, we're going to learn the second aorist. And the second aorist is normally described as the irregular formation. Okay, this is the one that historically has given students some real trouble. I'm going to start, though, with second aorist. And there's two reasons I'm going to do that. Number one is that second aorists have the same set of connecting vowels and personal endings that the imperfect has. So there's no new endings to learn at all in the second aorist. But the second reason I'm starting with the second aorist is that I want you to see something. The second aorist, yes, it's incredibly irregular if you don't know the relationship of roots to stems. But if you do know the relationships of roots to stem, then in fact second aorists are the most regularly formed aorists. It's really important that you know that. Okay, in a second aorist, the root is almost always going to come directly into the second aorist tense stem without modification. And so the second aorist is blissfully regular if you know that the second aorist tense stem comes from the root, not from the present tense stem, okay? So those are good reasons to start with the second aorist. Now again, in first to second aorist, there's no difference in meaning, all right? Whether it's a first or a second aorist, they still describe an undefined action normally occurring in the past. This is purely an issue of how you form the different aorist stems, okay? All right, so we're going to start with the second aorist. And Luo doesn't have a second aorist stem, so we're going to use a different word. We're going to use lambano. Now, lambano is from the root lob, and if you memorize those two things, then there's no big deal. I mean, you may look at lambano and go, well, how on earth did it go from lob to lambano? Well, it's actually pretty easy, isn't it? It added a mu before the beta and an alpha nu after the beta. So you get lambano in the present, elambanon in the imperfect, perfectly regular. Even in the future, it's a future middle deponent, but you can see what's happened. The alpha has lengthened to an eta, and the alpha nu because it was added to form the present tense stem, doesn't occur in the root and therefore doesn't occur in the future. And so you have this future middle deponent lempsemi. Okay, maybe a little weird, but you can see it and you should be able to identify it. But look what happens when you get into the second aorist. It is wonderfully regular, isn't it? Lob, the root, has come directly into the second aorist unmodified, and you have your augment and you have your connecting vowel and your secondary active endings. And so the second aorist of lambano is formed from the root lob, and you get elebon. And so that's what the master verb chart tells us. You form the second aorist active indicative with an augment aorist active tense stem, which is normally an unmodified version of the root, the connecting vowel and secondary active personal endings, and you get elabomen. Check out the full paradigm, and you get elebon, elebes, elebe with a new movable, elabomen, elabete, elebon. I took, you took, he, she, it took. There's your connecting vowels and secondary active personal endings. Now, what does elebon look like? I mean, at this point, if you just saw elebon, what would you think? Well, you think it's an imperfect, wouldn't you? Because in fact, it's identical to imperfects. And that's why you have the imperfect down the right-hand side. Eluon, LOS, LON, and so forth. Well, that brings up an interesting question, doesn't it? If you saw elebon, how would you know it's not an imperfect? Well, it's easy, isn't it? You would look at the tense stem, you would see lob, and you might think, oh, this is from the verb labo. And you go, wait a minute, there is no such word. Oh, this is the root of lambano. This can't be an imperfect of lambano because there's no mu, alpha, or nu. Therefore, this is the bare root. Oh, this has to be a second aorist. Okay, that process I just walked through is absolutely crucial for you to get a handle on second aorist, okay? That you look at the tense stem, you say, this is not the present tense stem. Oh, it's the root. This must be a second aorist. And let me give you a little more what's behind the scenes as to why that's the case. If you have a verb that has a second aorist form, the second aorist tense stem is always going to be different from the present tense stem. They're never going to be the same. Otherwise, you couldn't tell the difference between an imperfect and an aorist. Let me say it again. If a verb has a second aorist form, then that second aorist tense stem is always going to be different from the present tense stem. And the reason for that is this. In the formation of a verb with a second aorist, the root almost always comes unmodified into the second aorist tense stem. But if that's the case, then when that root goes into the present tense stem, it's always going to be modified. That's the theory behind that. But the way it works out in real life is that you're looking along in an inflected form. You're looking at the tense stem. You're saying, is that the present tense stem? No. Oh, it's just the root. Oh, this is probably, and this at this point in your Greek journey, it's going to be a present, an aorist, not a present. Let me show you just a couple of roots and what happens. And this is to emphasize how important it is that you do your memory work exactly. We have the root ball with a single lambda. It doubles the lambda in the formation of the present tense stem. Okay. But then when you get to the aorist, the ball goes unmodified and you get ebalon. But is ball and ball in the present the same or different? Well, they're going to be different because it's going to have a single lambda in the aorist, a double lambda in the present. In this chapter, you're going to learn the word ginomai. Ginomai, it comes from the root gin with an epsilon. That epsilon is modified in the formation of the present tense stem, but it goes unmodified into the aorist, and the epsilon is there, and you end up with egenamin. Now that is a middle deponent. We'll look at those in a second. But the point is that I want you to see how the roots, ball and gin, go into the aorist unmodified, but they're always modified when they go into the present tense stem. So the hints that I can give you at this point are three, really, and these are really important. Number one is make sure you memorize the root and the present tense stem exactly. As you can see in those words, the difference was one letter, one consonant, one vowel, just one little change, okay? So there's not that many vocabulary words to memorize in BBG. And so you need to memorize the present tense stem, your lexical form, and your root absolutely exactly to the consonant, to the vowel, okay? Secondly, now that we know second aorist, it's really important that when you're looking at an inflected form and maybe you're not sure what it is, that you ask yourself the question, is this tense stem the same as the present tense stem? If it's not, and you have a form like egenamine, because so you go, well, that's an epsilon. Oh, this is from ginomai. Oh, that's an iota. Oh, I can't be in the present tense system. And egenamine can't be an imperfect, even though it kind of looks like it, because the vowel in the stem is wrong. Okay, this has got to be a second aorist. Okay, so that's just a really important hint. And the third hint is you may want to go back into the appendix where I show you all the different tense forms of all the verbs and just look at the patterns. But back there's also a chart of all the second aorists you're going to learn. And I think it's just a page long. So you're going to want to pay attention to that. So anyway, do you understand why I've been pushing on roots and stems? I know it was a little harder in chapter 20 with the future. But again, if you're learning that, you're starting to really gain the benefit of understanding the difference between roots and stems. And this advantage that you have is going to carry through the rest of the tenses. All right. Well, let's switch over from the aorist active to the aorist middle. And again, I need to have a different vocabulary word. And I'm going to use the word ginomai because ginomai has an aorist middle deponent form. Ginomai means a lot of things. I become, am, exist, happen, take place, am born, am created. It's a very, very flexible word. But for our point now, you just need to know that ginomai is from the root gen. So as I said, the epsilon has shifted to an iota in the formation of the present tense stem. You get ginomai. You go to the imperfect, it's egenamine. Okay, you would recognize that as an imperfect. It's interesting to look at the future here. What's happened? Well, the roots come directly into the future. That's why there's an epsilon. An eta has been inserted before the tense formative, and this is the future middle deponent. So the future middle deponent of ginomai is genesamai. That's a little weird. You may need to memorize that because of the eta. But look what happens when it goes into the aorist. Ginomai has a second aorist, so the root's going into the aorist tense stem unmodified, and everything is blissfully regular. If you try to get from ginomai to egenamine, it's hard. But if you go from gen with an epsilon to both, it's not, is it? And by the way, the aorist passive is formed from a totally different tense stem, so that's why we're not talking about aorist passives in this chapter. So how do you form a second aorist middle indicative? You have an augment, an aorist active tense stem, a connecting vowel, and then secondary middle passive personal endings. Kind of like what we did with primary endings in the future middle. So anyway, you have the epsilon, gen, main, you get egenamine. Now remember, all the verbs that I'm showing you are deponents, so the definitions are all active. Of course, you couldn't even begin in English to make this a passive in meaning, could you? I was, became, by, or not. It doesn't work, does it? Anyway, the paradigm is egenamine, egenu, egenita, egenamatha, egenistha, egenanta. The same old connecting vowels and personal endings, secondary middle passive that you're used to. And then again, I listed the imperfect middle passive so you can see the comparison. And you can see why it's so important to know that gen is not the same as the present tense stem gin. That's how you know that egenamine is not an imperfect. Okay, what have we learned in this chapter? Well, we've learned the aorist tense. And the aorist tense is used to describe an undefined action normally occurring in past time. In terms of the formation of the aorist, we learned that in the next chapter we're going to learn the first aorist. In this chapter we learn the second aorist. And the second aorist is formed with an augment, the aorist active tense stem, a connecting vowel, and secondary personal endings. And we learned that the second aorist looks just like the imperfect, and that's why it's so important to do your memory work exactly so you can tell the difference between the present tense stem, which is a modified version of the root, and the aorist tense stem, which is usually the unmodified version of the root. And we've added 2 more lines to our master verb chart. How do you form the second aorist active? Well, you have an augment, the aorist active tense stem, connecting vowel, secondary active personal endings, and you end up with elebon. How do you form the second aorist middle? Augment plus aorist active tense stem, connecting vowel, and secondary middle passive personal endings, and you end up with egenamen. Okay, that's it for the grammar in the chapter. What I'm going to do now is I'll go through the vocabulary with you, and then I want to come back and go through the second aorist, and I just want to make sure that they're all clear for you, okay? So let's get to the vocabulary for the chapter.
Apothenesko. I die, am about to die, am freed from. Artos, artu, ha. Bread, loaf, food. Balo. I throw. Gay, gaze, hay. Earth, land, region, humanity. Ginomai. I become, am, exist, happen, take place, am born, am created. Eis erchomai. I come in, come into, go in, go into, enter. Exerchomai. I go out. Eti. Still, yet, even. Heurisco. I find. Lambano. I take, receive. Ute. And not, neither, nor. Proserchomai. I come to, I go to. Prosuchomai. I pray. Pur, puras, ta. Fire.
Okay, that's it for the vocabulary. So let's take a look at the second aorist that you know so far, okay? In this chapter you learned apothenesko, and it's from the root apothon. That's kind of weird, isn't it? How'd you get from apothon to apothenesko? Well, the alpha after the theta dropped out, and eta was added in, and then iota sigma kappa. We've seen that pattern before. Yeah, it's kind of weird. But when you get to the aorist, you notice what? Now, this is a compound verb, isn't it? You may not know that from apothenesko, but it's apethenon. Well, the omicron from the preposition after the piece dropped off. The augment goes on the verbal part before the theta. So second aorist, you get apethenon. Very regular. Then we saw balo. It's from the root bal. And so when you go to the aorist, it's ebelon, single lambda, perfectly regular. We've already talked about ginomai. It's from the root gen, and it's got a second aorist middle deponent, and you end up with egenamen, but the point being it's the epsilon from the root appears in the second aorist stem. If I could skip ahead to the previous word section, one of the words that we learned earlier was erchomai. It's from the root erch. Erchomai actually uses a totally different stem in the formation of its aorist. It uses eliuth. And its aorist is eilthon. Okay, this is one of those few exceptions to the general rule where I said the root comes unmodified in the second aorist. In the case of erchomai, what happened was that the epsilon upsilon dropped out of the root in the formation of its aorist tense stem. After that, it's all regular. Right? The epsilon lengthens to an eta for the augment, and you end up with eilthon. So the second aorist of erchomai is eilthon. So now we go back to the new vocabulary, and the next word is eis erchomai. It's a compound verb, eis and erchomai, and so the verbal part is going to behave in the compound just like it does in the single, and so the aorist is eis eilthon. You can see why knowing your vocabulary is so important. If you just see eis eilthon, you may not pick up that the eta is your augment. So you can see how important it is to really know your vocabulary well. The next verb is another compound of erchomai. It's ex-erchomai, and so the aorist is ex-ealthon, no surprises. And then you get heurisco. Now, heurisco is from the root hewer, so the iota sigma kappa was added to form the present tense stem. So you can see it in the imperfect, although the imperfect sometimes has a little trouble deciding whether it's going to lengthen that initial epsilon or not. The future's a little weird. You got heureso. The eta was added before the tense formative. That actually is a pattern in Greek. We'll see it several times. But after that, it's absolutely regular. But look at the aorist. It's huron. Okay, this is one of those roots that starts with a diphthong that doesn't show the augment, and you get huron. Now, you're not going to be able to get from huron back to heurisco unless you know that the root is hewer, right? All right. Lambano, we've already talked about, comes from the root lob, so you have a second aorist. It's elabon, no big deal. Another compound with erchomai, this time is proserchomai, so the aorist is prosealthon. And we learned proseuchomai, an absolutely regular verb, has a root ending in a velar, so the velar plus sigma forms a C in the aorist. Now this particular word is a middle deponent, and the initial epsilon on the diphthong does lengthen, and you get proseuxamen. May want to look at that for just a bit to make sure you understand it. So going back to the previous word section, we already know the verb gnosko. It's from the root gno, and that root was definitely modified in the formation of the present tense stem. But when you get into the aorist, it's perfectly regular, isn't it? Egnon, no big surprises. The omega has swallowed up the connecting vowels, so egnon is the aorist of gnosko. Ekbalo, well, we know that the root of balo is bal with a single lambda, so in the aorist it's exepilon, no surprises. We know the verb echo, and hopefully you remember that it's from the root sec, sigma epsilon chi. When you get into the second aorist, the only thing you really need to notice is that the epsilon of the root has dropped off. Again, another exception to that rule. And you end up with escon. Lego has a second aorist apon. Totally different root is used to form apon. You may want to check the footnote in the textbook. And also horao uses a totally different root in the formation of its second aorist, adon. Again, you may want to check the footnotes there. And then we come to the last verb in the previous word section. It's sunago. Now, sunago is a compound verb, and ago is an interesting word. It undergoes a double augment. Ago doubles itself to alpha, gamma, and then that reduplicated alpha lengthens to an eta, and you get sunegagon. Okay, that's a little weird. Again, you may want to memorize that also. But once you see it, it's not that hard to identify, I don't think. Okay, that's it for second aorist. Wasn't that hard, was it? Again, let me emphasize that this chapter is so much easier for you because you know the whole issue of roots and stems. So keep memorizing your vocabulary. That's the present tense stem. And that root exactly and precisely. And these things will all work out for you, okay? All right, have fun with the workbook. In chapter 23, we're going to be learning the first aorist, both the active and the middle. The previous chapter, we learned the second aorist, so it's time to learn the first aorist. Most Greek verbs have first aorist, so it's an important chapter, but it's a short chapter and an easy chapter because the first aorist is very easy to form. So it's not going to take a long time to get through this chapter, okay? In terms of meaning, remember that the difference between first and second aorist has nothing to do with meaning. Whether it's a first or second aorist, the aorist describes an action that normally occurs in the past and is undefined in its aspect. The difference between first and second aorist has to do with how you form them, okay? And there's two basic things going on in a first aorist. First of all, first aorists use a tense formative. So we had a sigma as a tense formative in the future. Well, the tense formative for a first aorist is sigma alpha. So you will learn to see that saw, and it'll just bounce out at you, and you'll be able to tell, this is an aorist, no big deal. The other thing that's kind of nice about first aorist is that if a verb has a first aorist, then the root and the present tense stem and the aorist tense stem are generally all the same. No variations at all. So pretty straightforward. So how do you form a first aorist? Okay. Well, you form them with an augment, an aorist active tense stem, a tense formative, which is the sa, and then secondary active personal endings. And you end up with a form like elusamen. See that you've got an augment there, the sa, you got stuff bouncing out at you. These are very easy forms to identify. When you look at the full paradigm, it's elusa, elusas, eluse with a new movable, elusamen, elusate, elusan. You can see the augment and the tense formative telling you it's an aorist. When you look at the personal endings, you can see that for the most part, they are secondary active endings, and for the most part, look just like the endings that you have on the imperfect. The one big difference is first person singular, though, isn't it? There's no personal ending used in the first person singular of a first aorist. It's elusa, not elusan with the new, which is what you might expect from an imperfect. Okay, this is just one of the oddities of the first aorist system. You'll also notice another oddity that in the third person singular, the tense formative sa has gone to se, sigma epsilon. I'm assuming that's because Greeks wanted to be able to distinguish in form the first from the third person singular. But other than that, these things are very straightforward. This may be a good time to start your exception list. And all that an exception list is a one page. Maybe you'll fill out the front and back if you write large. But an exception list is just a list of the exceptions to the rules. The rules that I've shown you are going to carry you through and explain almost all the forms you have to know. But every once in a while, there's just going to be a little odd thing out, and you kind of want to put all those odd things out in one place so you can remember them. That's what the exception list is for. So the first thing is going to be the first person singular of a first aorist. There's no personal ending, and it's elusa, not elusan. Okay? The second thing you're going to put is in the third person singular, the tense formative goes from sa to se. But again, there are so many third person singular aorist forms that this is not going to give you a problem, but you'll want to write it down in your exception list. The other thing you may want to write down is this. Where else do you see a sigma right after the tense stem? It's in the future, isn't it? But when you're in the future, what always follows the sigma? Well, it's a connecting vowel, isn't it? It's always omicron or epsilon. So when you see that sigma after the stem, you need to look over and see what the vowel is. And if it's sa with an omicron or se with an epsilon, then in all cases but one, you're in the future. If it's sigma alpha, you're always in an aorist, okay? Now that one exception, of course, is the third person singular. But again, you're going to see this so often, it's not going to be hard. So that's the beginning of your exception list, and you should be writing that down, or perhaps someplace in the grammar you could write it down. Okay, let me give you 4 odds and ends we need to cover when it comes to first aorist, and they're pretty, for the most part, they're straightforward. The first has to do with contract stems. Contract stems behave perfectly regularly. That final vowel is going to lengthen before the tense formative blissfully regularly, okay? So agapao, for example, in this aorist is agapesa. So there's that eta before the sigma. Second odds and end has to do with stems ending in stops. When you take that sigma, the tense formative, and put it up against the stop, the same kind of changes that we saw in the future are going to be happening in the aorist. So again, perfectly regular for you. So you have the verb blepo. When it goes to the aorist, it's eblepsa. Okay? In terms of velar stems, you have a verb like tarasso, and you know that aso words actually have stems ending in a velar. Velar plus sigma form a xi, and so the aorist of tarasso is etaraxa, sigma alpha. And when it comes to dental stems, remember the dental drops out before the sigma. And so if you have a verb like baptizo, you know that the root is actually a dental stem, right? It's baptid. The dental drops out before the sigma, and you get the aorist ebaptisa. Now, that's an interesting word. You may look at that and you go, oh, there's an augment, I'm going to cut it off, and there's a sigma alpha, that's the tense formative. And you have baptio, and you go, look, I don't know any word baptio, so you go looking in a dictionary. Well, that's why you got to know your roots, okay? So when you see the ebaptis, you can recognize it's a dental stem, but the dental's dropped off. But contract stems and stems in a stop are very regular in the first aorist, so that's not a problem. The third odds and end has to do with second aorist stems with first aorist endings. Now, fortunately, this only occurs with a few words, and I've listed them in the grammar. But there's two that you really need to know. And you need all of them, but you really need to know two of them. Normally, the second aorist is apon with an omicron, but sometimes you'll find apan with an alpha. Also, the form aelthon. Normally, it's the omicron, which is the normal second aorist ending, but sometimes you'll find aelthan with an alpha. Those are just first aorist endings being stuck on second aorist stems. But just be aware of them. It shouldn't be a problem, okay? The third odds and end is a little bit bigger of a deal, and it has to do with liquid aorists. Now, liquid stems only affect us in the future and the aorist, so once we've learned this, we're done, okay? The oddity of a liquid aorist is that the tense formative is not sigma alpha, the tense formative is an alpha. See, liquids just don't like the sigma, and they're going to get rid of them. So the tense formative for a liquid stem in the aorist is going to be the simple alpha. So let's take a look at that. A liquid aorist, which is a first aorist, is formed with an augment, the aorist active tense stem, the tense formative alpha, and then secondary active personal endings, and you get a form like amenamen. Now there's something else though going on in this form. The lexical form is meno with an epsilon, but when you get into the aorist, that epsilon, due to ablaut, has changed to epsilon iota, and you get amenamen. Well, I thought you said this was the first aorist. Well, it is, but this is the one time that the root is regularly modified in the formation of a first aorist tense stem, and that is with liquids. So it's real common in liquids to have some kind of stem vowel change when you're in the aorist. But that's actually a blessing, okay? You're reading along in an inflected form, and you see amenamen, and you take off the augment, and you take off the endings, and you end up with main, mu epsilon iota nu, and you go, is this the present tense stem? You go, oh, no. So even if you haven't caught that it's a first aorist liquid, the change in the vowel should alert you that you're outside of the present tense system. So the change is actually a blessing, but that does happen often with liquids in the first aorist, okay? So take a look at the paradigm. Amena, amenus, amena with a new movable, amenamen, amenate, amenan. And when you compare them to a non-liquid first aorist, you can see that they're just the same thing. In the appendix for BBG, there is a list of all the liquid verbs, so you may want to go take a look at them. You don't know all of them now, but you may want to go take a look at it and kind of look at the patterns and just to make sure they make sense to you, okay? All right. Enough for the first aorist active. Let's learn the first aorist middle. Well, the first aorist middle is formed with an augment, aorist active tense stem, tense formative, sa, and secondary middle passive personal endings. And you have elusamen. Now, luo may not have been the best choice for this paradigm because all the middles that I've shown you so far are deponent, and luo isn't deponent, but it's short and it fits on the screen, so I used it, okay? So in the paradigm, I'm going to give you active meanings as if luo were a middle deponent. It's not, but you understand. So we get elusamen, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusasta, elusanta. And you can compare it to the second aorist middle of Ginamai. You can see that they're consistent all the way through, except for the second person singular. And this is just a change due to contractions. There's a different set of vowels contracting in a first aorist middle. The sigma of the personal ending has dropped out between the alpha of the tense formative and the omicron of the personal ending. And so you have sigma alpha omicrons contract to omega, and you get eluso for the second person singular. But other than that, things are what you would expect. Well, that was a nice short chapter, wasn't it? Not a whole lot there, just a tense formative, and that's about it. So in summary, let's see what we've learned in this chapter. We saw that first and second aorists don't differ in meaning. They both describe an action normally occurring in the past, always undefined in aspect. The only difference is one of formation. In order to form a first aorist, you have an augment, the first aorist tense stem, the sigma alpha as a tense formative, and then the secondary active or the secondary middle personal endings. We saw that contract verbs behave themselves, lengthening that final vowel before the tense formative. We saw that stems ending in a stop are rewritten just like they were in the future, so no big deal there. And the one oddity of a liquid aorist stem is that it uses the tense formative in alpha, and the root is sometimes modified, usually I would guess, in the formation of the aorist tense stem. And so that change in vowel will help tell you you're in the aorist and not in the present. We have 3 new lines on the master verb chart. The first aorist active is formed with an augment, aorist active tense stem, sa as a tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and we have elusa. The liquid aorist active, which is the first aorist, is formed with an augment, aorist active tense stem, alpha as its tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and we have emena. And we also learned the first aorist middle, which has an augment, aorist active tense stem, sa for a tense formative, secondary middle passive personal endings, and we get elusamen. So that wasn't very hard, was it? No, all right. Well, let's learn the vocabulary for this chapter so you can get into the exercises.
Aperchomai. I depart.
Archomai.
I begin. Grapho. I write. Dia. Therefore, for this reason. Doxazo.
I praise, honor, glorify.
Dunamis. Dunameos. Hey. Power, miracle. Keruso. I proclaim, preach. Pino. I drink.
In chapter 24, we're going to fill out your understanding of the aorist and the future tenses. Specifically, we're going to be learning the aorist passive and the future passive forms of the verb. I know it's kind of strange sounding for those two to be lumped together, but you'll see why in a second. A couple things in English first. In the formation of English verbs, there are 3 principal parts, right? Eat, ate, eaten. Study, studied, studied. Okay, in the translation of the aorist and the future passive, we're going to be using that 3rd principal part along with a helping verb. So in order to translate an aorist passive, it'll be something like, I was flunked, or they were flunked. And in the future passive, it's I will be passed, or they will be passed. There is technically, I guess in English, a future continuous, I will be being passed, or something like that, but I don't know if I've ever heard anyone ever use it. So in the translation of the future passive, just use the undefined, the simple form of the English verb. I will be passed. All right? Good. Okay, a couple things about the Greek system when it comes to the aorist and the future passive. As I've said earlier, the middle and the passive are distinctly different forms, so that's why we didn't discuss the passive in earlier chapters. And the future passive is actually formed off of the aorist passive stem. That's why we talk about them in the same chapter. Now, while the stem will be augmented in the aorist passive, it'll be unaugmented in the future passive, and there'll be some other changes. But basically, the future passive is formed off of the aorist passive stem, and that's why we talk about them together. The chapter's not a hard chapter. There's mostly just charts and a few basic rules for the master verb chart. So more charts than normal, but it's not hard, so don't worry about it. The other thing I needed to say is that when you go to the lexicon and you look up a verb and you're looking at all the different tense forms, the 6th and final one is the aorist passive. Now in BBG, if a word never occurs in an aorist passive, but it does occur in the future passive, then I list the future passive form. Otherwise, I just list the aorist passive form. But it's the last of the tense stems. And we've skipped over a couple. We're going to learn them in the next chapter. But the aorist passive is the final tense form. Okay? All right. Well, let's jump into the paradigms and fill out your understanding of the master verb chart. How do you form the first aorist passive indicative? Well, you start with an augment, an aorist passive tense stem, and then the tense formative is theta eta. And what's really nice about that, I don't know if it's because of the height of the theta or what, but the theta eta is really easy to see. It's going to jump out at you. These things are very easy to identify. The one thing that's a little strange is that a first aorist passive is going to use secondary active endings. And so you end up with eleuthein. Look at the full paradigm, and it's eleuthein, eleuthes, eleuthe, eleuthemin, eleutheta, eleutheson. I was loosed, you were loosed, he, she, it was loosed. And there you can see the endings as you would expect for the secondary active, nu, sigma, nothing, mente. Well, then there's son, isn't it? Okay, get out that exception list, and here's another one to put in there. Son is an alternate third plural ending for the secondary active endings. And it's a pretty common one. So make sure you know that in the first aorist passive indicative, the third plural is son. Now, because the aorist passive tense formative starts with the theta, if the stem ends in a stop, the stop plus theta sound is an awkward conjunction of sounds in Greek. And so any stem that ends in a stop is going to do something right before the theta. So let's review the square stops, and I'll show you what's going to happen. You remember the labials are P beta phi, the velars are kappa gamma he, and the dentals are tau delta theta. You'll also remember that I asked you to learn the square stops vertically. The voiceless are P kappa tau, the voiced are beta gamma delta, and for our purposes, the most important column are the aspirates. They are phi, he, theta. Okay, here's what's going to happen. If a stem ends in a labial, specifically a P or a beta, that stop will go to a phi so it can be pronounced smoothly with a theta. If the stem ends in a kappa or gamma, it's going to go to a he before the theta. But when you get the dentals, it's a little more complicated than that. If you have a stem ending in a tau or a delta, it does turn to a theta, but then you have two thetas in a row, which you really can't say. And so that first theta is turned to a sigma. Here's what that looks like. You have the root blep, and in the aorist passive, it's eblephthane. With dioko, the stem and the velar, you end up with diochthane. And if you have the root baptid, which shows itself in the present as baptidzo, you end up with ebaptisthane. Now, the easy thing to remember there is that when you have a stop before a theta, something's going to happen to the stop. And even if you can't quite remember what's going to happen, generally, if you remember that something's going to happen to a stop before a theta, these forms are relatively easy to parse. But it's good to know the actual rules, okay? All right, let's go to the second aorist passive. And the only basic difference there is from the first aorist is that the tense formative is different. The tense formative is not a theta eta, it's the simple eta. So you form a second aorist passive with an augment aorist passive tense stem, the tense formative eta, and then secondary active personal endings. And you get a form like agraphemin. Now, grapho is kind of a confusing word to use for the paradigm because it has a first aorist active, but in the aorist passive, this is one of the oddities of the word grapho. It is a second aorist. And so you have agraphane, agraphes, agraphe, agraphemin, agrapheta, agrapheson. I was written, you were written, he, she, it was written, so forth. Same secondary active endings you're used to, including that alternate third plural ending. Okay, so much for the aorist passive. Let's switch over to the future passive. And there's just a couple of basic changes that are going to happen. The future passive is going to use the aorist passive tense stem. That much is in common. But it's going to be unaugmented. The tense formative is going to be just a little. And instead of secondary active endings, The future passive is going to use primary middle passive endings, okay? So the aorist tense stem unaugmented is what joins the future passive and the aorist passive. But after that, there's little differences. So here are the forms. So the first future passive is formed with the unaugmented aorist passive tense stem. And then to that is added the tense formative. And the future passive tense formative is theta eta sigma. Now, I don't know if this is actually how the Greeks went about forming the these, but in terms of memory work, it's kind of nice. The theta eta, you're used to thinking in terms of the aorist passive, and the sigma, you're used to thinking in connection with the future active, right? So these is a pretty easy thing to remember as being the tense formative for the first future passive. But then to that, you add your connecting vowel and your primary, since this is an unaugmented tense, a primary but middle passive personal endings. Remember, the aorist passive uses secondary active. The future passive uses primary middle passive. So you get something like luthesomai. Go into the full paradigm and you get luthesomai, luthese, luthesetai, luthesamatha, luthesestha, luthesantai. Everything there is absolutely regular, exactly what you would expect, including the sigma dropping out in the contraction in the second person singular. Now, for the most part, that theta eta sigma is going to stand out like a sore thumb to you, a wonderful sore thumb, and it's going to say future passive, future passive. Now, there's only one place, though, that the theta eta sigma might give you some trouble. What is that? You may have noticed it when I went through the paradigm. Yeah, the third plural aorist passive is thesan, theta eta sigma alpha nu. But you do have a theta eta sigma there. But for the most part, it shouldn't cause you any trouble, because if it's the future passive, it's going to be theta eta sigma and then a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon. And in the third plural, the aorist, is theta eta sigma alpha. And also, if it's an aorist passive, you're going to have an augment and active ending. So the theta eta sigma, for the most part, is very clear that it's a future passive, except unless it's the aorist passive third plural. All right, let's move on to the second future passive. And again, it's going to be just like the first future passive, except that the tense formative is going to be a little different. Instead of being theta eta sigma, what would you guess it's going to be? Well, think about it. If the aorist passive goes from theta eta in a first aorist to eta in a second aorist, then the first future, which is theta eta sigma, is going to go to eta sigma in the second future passive. So the second future passive is formed with an unaugmented aorist passive tense stem, the tense formative eta sigma, a connecting vowel, and again, primary middle passive personal endings. And we're going to use the paradigmatic verb apostello, I send, for the second future passive, and you get apostolesomai. That's a mouthful, isn't it? So the full paradigm is apostolesomai, apostolese, apostolesetai, apostolesamatha, apostolesestha, apostolesantai. And again, the connecting vowels and personal endings as you would expect. Okay, so much for this chapter on the future and the aorist passive. Pretty straightforward again. It's the master verb chart is the key to everything, isn't it? Okay, let's summarize what we've learned. We've learned the aorist and future passive are formed from the same tense form, the sixth one listed in the lexicon, which technically is known as the aorist passive tense form. The tense formative for the aorist passive is theta eta if it's a first aorist, or an eta if it's a second aorist. And so the aorist passive is formed with the augment, the aorist passive tense stem, the appropriate tense formative, and secondary active endings. The tense formative for the future passive is, if it's a first passive, theta eta sigma. If it's a second future passive, it's an eta sigma. And so the future passive is formed on the unaugmented aorist passive tense stem, the appropriate tense formative, a connecting vowel, and primary middle passive personal endings. And we've got 4 new lines on the master verb chart. We're almost done with this chart, so hang in there. The first future passive is formed from an unaugmented aorist passive tense stem. The tense formative is theta, eta, sigma, connecting vowels, primary, middle, passive personal endings. And so you get something like luthesimi. The second future passive is also an unaugmented aorist passive tense stem. Tense formative is eta, sigma, connecting vowel, primary, middle, passive personal endings. And you end up with apostolesimi. The first aorist passive is formed with an augmented aorist passive tense stem. Theta, eta is a tense formative, secondary active personal endings, and you have eluthane. And the second aorist passive is also an augmented aorist passive tense stem with a tense formative eta. Personal endings are secondary active, and you have agraphane. Okay, mostly charts, but pretty straightforward, I think. So let's do the vocabulary, and you can get on with the chapter.
Ago. I lead, bring, arrest. Haima, haimatas, ta. Blood. Hekastas, hekaste, hekastan. Each, every. Himation, himatiu, ta. Garment, cloak. Oras, orus, ta. Mountain, hill. Hupago, I depart. Phobeomai, I fear. Chairo, I rejoice.